Good. Okay, so Mike said he wants me to talk about globalization. Yeah. So why not? I always just do what I'm told. So, what's globalization? Actually, the best definition of it I know of, if I can remember it, is by a very well-known development economist, Canadian development economist, a guy named Gerald Heliner, who tried to summarize it in a little ditty, which went something like this. Don't hold me to the exact words. He said, "The poor complain, they always do, but that's just idle chatter. Our system brings rewards to all, at least to all who matter." That essentially captures it. Okay, I can go home. So the only question is, how do the poor complain? Why is it idle chatter? Who are the poor? Who matters? And so on. So what about the poor complaining? Actually, they do complain, and they complain very loudly and in very interesting ways. So, for example, in April of this year, a couple of weeks ago, there were the first ever meeting of the heads of state of the what's called G77. It's actually like 133 or so now, representing, well, accounting for, there's a difference, accounting for roughly 80% of the world's population. They had their first really high-level meeting in Havana in April. A week earlier, the foreign ministers had met in Cartagena in Colombia. And they came out, and I don't know why they selected Havana, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's a solidarity gesture, maybe. It was a very important meeting. These are what used to be called the non-aligned countries in the days when there was a space for non-alignment. That disappeared with the Soviet Union. There's no longer any space for non-alignment, and that means that the minimal attention that was once given to what's called the South has declined to virtually zero. You can see that in all kinds of ways, foreign aid, all kind of measures. They produced, this was their, as I said, first really high-level meeting ever, so an important one. They came out with a long, detailed declaration called the Declaration of the South Summit, which was highly critical of globalization, the particular form of globalization that's being instituted, that's essentially corporate-led globalization concerned with the interests of investors and lenders. Everything else is sort of incidental. And they called for a new era, a new global era, which would have a different orientation, which they then spelled out in some detail. The basic idea is that the new global form of global integration that they were calling for would give a primacy to the right of development, in fact, the right of independent development for the so-called developing countries, many of them developing downwards, unfortunately, the poor countries, the South, the former colonial world, and would permit them to pick their own development path without any form of economic coercion or pressure in terms of their own national priorities and interests, and opposed all forms of, they rejected completely all forms of unilateral economic sanctions. About half the world's population right now is under unilateral U.S. sanctions, so that's who they're talking to. And they also rejected forcefully what they called, this is their phrase, the so-called right of humanitarian intervention, which they consider just old-fashioned European imperialism under a very familiar garb of, righteous moralism, just as it had always been in the past. That's the gist of it, in a long, developed extensively. It's not the first time. Back in the 1960s, early 1970s, just at about the time of the onset of the era that is now called globalization in the West, there was also a kind of a South Summit, a non-aligned meeting, which called for a new international economic order of a similar kind. Not the same words and the same details, but roughly that. Including interesting proposals, which have had a lot of contemporary resonance. So that was about the time that, at that point, this was after about 10 or 15 years of decolonization, and there was a lot of energy and momentum in the non-aligned movement, which is essentially the decolonized countries for the most part. And they had succeeded in getting the United Nations to form the UN Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD, which was formed in 1964, and it still exists, and it's the major semi-independent economic analysis organization in the world, in fact, under UN auspices, come out with regular and sometimes important reports. UNCTAD was formed in order to, with a mandate. The mandate was to work on methods of global integration, international integration, that would be very much like what I just quoted from the South Summit, which would be concerned with the right of development, and in particular independent development, free of external coercion. And they came out with many specific proposals. Of course, this was totally dismissed by the rich countries. Nobody ever heard about it anymore. And UNCTAD itself was kind of marginalized, just as every aspect of the United Nations, every institution of the United Nations, which to some extent represents third world interests, interests of the South, has been either eliminated or pushed very far to the side. So UNCTAD still exists, but not in very powerful form. One of their proposals, one of them, a particularly important one, which has lots of contemporary implications, was a proposal to stabilize commodity prices. The South, the poor countries, are mostly were at the time, to some extent still are, still primary product producers. Every rich country, say the United States or European Union and so on, has internal programs to stabilize commodity prices. So there's various farm subsidies and so on. These are very high in the European Union, quite high in the United States. They've actually increased very radically in the last several years, right after Congress passed what was called a Freedom to Farm Act in 1996, which was designed to terminate subsidies and all other interferences with the holy market. And it did it in the usual way by leading to a tripling of subsidies in the next 2 years, almost all going to agribusiness and avoiding farmers. And the same is true of other countries, European Union, even more than the United States. The point of to try to keep farm prices more or less stable, commodity prices in general. Well, that was the proposal of UNCTAD, except that they were proposing it for the poor countries. And there's a good reason for that. I mean, if primary products oscillate rapidly, say coffee, to take a case that happens to be crucial, it's the second biggest commodity in international exchanges after oil. If coffee prices shoot way up and down, that has an effect. It does not affect agribusiness particularly. So big agribusiness can displace costs. You can take a loss here if coffee prices go way down. You can, say, take a loss here 1 year and make a profit somewhere else, or make a profit in some other part of your enterprise, and so on. On the other hand, a small farmer can't do that. If you're a small farmer and you happen to be a coffee farmer and a coffee producer, say in Colombia or Bolivia or somewhere, and coffee prices go down, you're finished. You can't tell your children, wait a year or two, maybe you'll be able to eat then. So you have to do something else. Well, what else you do is move to crops for which there is a stable market. There happens to be one export crop for which there is a stable market, and it happens to be grown in some of the major coffee-producing areas like the Andes, like Colombia. So yeah, that's what they moved to, and that move was accelerated by other programs, including those that are central to the so-called globalization period. I'll whenever I say globalization, I mean in quotes. You know, what's called globalization is one specific modality of international integration. There's nothing wrong with international integration. In fact, it's a great thing. It's nice to meet people from other countries and all sorts of other stuff. But there are various forms of possible international integration, and the one that's called globalization is one particular one. Like, it's not the new international economic order that the South was calling for, and it's not the new global system that they're now calling for. It's a different one. This new one, the one that is called global, the official one, you know, the one that Thomas Friedman writes laudatory books about and so on, that's the one that, among its other properties, are that countries have to open up their borders to free imports. So they have to accept imports from highly subsidized U.S. and European and Canadian agribusiness, which of course instantly wipes out domestic production for domestic needs, and that means that poor farmers are stuck. One thing they can do is flee to the cities, which has the nice effect that they create a massive labor force which lowers wages, and it means that U.S. and European manufacturers, or by now Japanese and Korean manufacturers who are putting, say, assembly plants or whatever abroad, can benefit from cheaper labor, and consequently wages can go down, and in fact do go down while the economy booms. Mexico is a dramatic case. But if farmers don't move to the urban slums to become an excess labor force, they again, and try to produce something, it can't be commodities for the domestic market for food, because they'll be wiped out by imported goods. So once again, they move to they become what's called a rational peasant in the technical literature. A rational peasant is a peasant who understands that you have to produce for export and you have to seek the maximum profit. Okay, so you sort of spell that out: produce for export, stable markets, maximum profit. Well, you get the same answer as before. Cocoa, you know, poppies, and so on. And that's what's happening. So the globalization, in particular the undermining of the attempts of the South 30 years ago to create a form of globalization directed toward the interests of the developing world. That means, you know, almost the entire world. One of the major consequences of this, and it's no big secret, like you can read it in standard books of political economy and so on, was to greatly accelerate drug production of what we call drugs. I mean, they're not the most lethal drugs. The most lethal ones are produced in places like North Carolina, but what we call lethal drugs here, peasants have been driven to it. They really have no choices, in part by the choice, and it was a choice. It's not an economic law. The choice by the powerful states 30 years ago to institute a particular form of international economic integration, what's called globalization, in preference to another one, one which would have, for example, as one of its properties, and there were many others, things like stabilization of primary commodity prices, and what are called neoliberal programs, like opening up your borders to imports from subsidized agro-export from northern agribusiness. That has the same effect. There's a lot more like this. I mean, a lot of what happens to the rational peasants, incidentally, after they've learned their lessons properly. You know, they kind of like the equivalent of going to Harvard or MIT or Chicago graduate school and getting a degree in economics, so they become rational peasants. Well, once they've learned the lesson, they're rewarded. They're rewarded with helicopter gunships that you and I pay for, with chemical and biological warfare, including new experimental biological techniques that will have who knows what effect, and by what's called here a drug war. You know, that's the reward for having learned the lessons after having been essentially forced into a particular kind of production by the way globalization works out. That's one of its less discussed features. Going back to the Declaration of the South, the poor are complaining, as they always do. What they're calling for now, again, is a new international. They're calling for globalization, for international